This is the official Super Smash Bros. Melee community tier list, or at least the closest you can get to an official tier list in a community as decentralized as Melee's. This ranking is the aggregate of the opinions of Melee's brightest minds, top players, and analysts with thousands of hours of experience, often spanning multiple decades. The Melee community is among the most passionate in all of competitive gaming, but their single-minded dedication to one of the world's oldest competitive gaming scenes has managed to produce a ranking that is almost certainly definitively wrong. Of course, this list is from 2021, but more recent tier lists aren't necessarily right either. These tier lists by Moki, currently ranked 5th in the world, and Hungrybox, currently ranked 3rd, were both made within the past year or so and are also, in all likelihood, definitively wrong. A lot of this comes back to Melee's insane complexity, which turns making a truly accurate tier list into gaming's version of a millennium problem. But to illustrate why, we have to talk about a few things, starting with Yoshi. If you have even a surface level familiarity of Melee's competitive scene, you've probably heard of Yoshi's meteoric rise through the ranks. In 2010, Yoshi was ranked 21st out of 26 characters. Listed among characters on the tier list commonly considered to be literally non-functional. In 2013, he rose a bit to the 18th spot, and by 2015, he had ascended to 12th, before finally peaking at 10th in the 2021 community tier list we just looked at, finally reaching top 10 status roughly 20 years after the game's release. Top player consensus has landed him somewhere around that 10th spot ever since. He's not just a functional character, but an actively good one. If you're already familiar with this unprecedented 11 spot increase, you probably already know the singular person responsible. Amsa isn't just the best Yoshi in the world, he's essentially the only top Yoshi in the world. The character's rise to 18th coincided with Amsa's appearance at 77th on the top 100 rankings that year, and his subsequent rise to top 10 status is pretty well synced up with Amsa's personal ascent, which peaked at 2nd in the world. But because nobody else has managed to even come close to replicating Amsa's success, Yoshi is essentially being propped up by the efforts of one singular person. Where would Yoshi be without Amsa? Or should we instead be asking, how many characters at the bottom or even the middle of these tier lists just haven't gotten their Amsa yet? But this isn't just another Yoshi video, because while he has become the poster child for potential tier list inaccuracies, he's far from the only example of top player representation single-handedly impacting the tier list. And no, I'm not merely alluding to other historically bad characters like Donkey Kong, although we will have to talk about him later. I'm actually referring to some of the most explored top tiers in the game. In a game as difficult as Melee, the barrier to entry is relatively high, and the barrier to top level play is prohibitive. Put simply, virtually every character in the game suffers from what would be considered a low sample size in most other communities, with the possible exception of Fox, who is by far the most popular character in the top 100. Because the gap between your average Melee player and the handful of people at the top is so big, even higher tiered characters move up and down often based on the relative performance of that small group of top players. This gives many tier lists a strong element of recency bias, where the community views an individual top player winning or losing as a legitimate representation of the character itself getting stronger and weaker in the meta, despite a complete lack of patches. Within the top 5, this is most visible with Jigglypuff, a character unavoidably linked to Hungrybox. For most of the game's modern history, Puff has been considered the 5th best character, but rose to 3rd following Hungrybox's period of extreme dominance pre-COVID, where he was ranked 1st for 3 full years in a row. During this period of time, there was even discussion of Puff being the best character in the game, despite Hungrybox's position as the only Puff player winning tournaments. But eventually, when that period of dominance came to a close, as players like Zane and Cody Schwab ushered in a new era of Melee, Jigglypuff conveniently settled right back to her old spot in 5th on most people's tier lists, as Hungrybox also settled back down to earth. The success of one of Melee's longest competitive careers has taught us that this 5th place spot is Jigglypuff's floor, but it's difficult not to see Jigglypuff's position in the top tier as an assessment of Hungrybox's personal position in the meta, rather than an accurate assessment of the actual character's power, since no other Puff has won a major besides Hungrybox since Mango did it at Pound 4 in 2010. We've already seen a similar effect in action when Armada, one of 2 players with the strongest claim to the title of greatest of all time, retired from competition. Armada's retirement almost immediately saw his main, Peach, lose a spot on the tier list to Falcon, and since then, community sentiment on the character has cooled off a bit, despite the fact that 3 Peach players are in the top 20 in the most recent summer 2025 rankings. Falco has also lost some ground in recent years, and in exchange, Marth has solidly cemented himself in 2nd place, thanks in large part to the success of Zane, the best player in the current modern era of Melee. So even the top of the Melee tier list is subject to variation and the whims of recency bias, but outside of Puff, very few of Melee's top 7 or 8 characters could be considered one-guy characters, and any shift in ranking is more often than not a legitimate shift in the meta rather than a correction of a real inaccuracy. After all, Melee might not get patches, but it is still a constantly changing game, even 20 plus years after its release, and that change has only accelerated in the Slippy era, with online play and training packs like Uncle Punch absolutely revolutionizing the way people practice. Refinement of tech skill can impact individual matchups and further develop specific interactions, but even in a game as undefinable and shifting as Melee, certain things are set in stone. For example, if Marth continues to produce insane results for the next couple years, it's entirely possible that at some point in the future Fox will drop into 2nd on the tier list. But we're never going to wake up to the news that Fox was secretly a low tier. And that means even if the top tiers are constantly shifting, almost by definition, we need to set our sights a little lower if we want to talk about the bigger swings Melee's tier list is subject to. And specifically, that means talking about the line of viability, which lies somewhere around Dr. Mario. This unofficial line divides the tier list into 2 sections: characters that you can expect to see at top 8s of major tournaments at least sometimes, and characters you probably won't see at a top 8 pretty much ever. The tier directly above this line of viability contains characters that have to fight a real uphill battle to step onto the biggest stages. The notoriously difficult Yoshi is joined by Pikachu, who has also been represented at a top level by a single player, Axe, for most of the game's modern competitive history. Directly below that sit Samus and Luigi, who, despite being pretty decent and significantly easier to play, simply aren't all that popular due to their unique playstyles. And directly below that sits a cliff. Luigi showing up in top 8 is a novelty, but it does happen, and an appearance in top 64 isn't even all that uncommon. For any character below Luigi to show up in a major top 8 is somewhat literally a historical event, to the point where these characters could barely even be considered a part of the competitive scene at all. That's why Amsa's rise to the top was so exciting. It represented not just a weak character being optimized, but an entirely new presence in the game. Yoshi isn't the only character represented by a small number of specialists, but by the time AMSA appeared on people's radars, most people had, somewhat fairly, begun to assume that the decade plus of prior Melee history had been plenty of time to refine a truly accurate tier list. In a way, AMSA paved the way not only for any future Yoshi players, but for the whole community to reevaluate the entire half of the roster that sits below the line of viability. This movement gained a lot more steam with the popularization of Slippy, allowing characters that would have previously struggled to get good practice to queue up and participate in online play, exponentially increasing the amount of hours being put into exploring choices that would have previously been thought of as suboptimal. Most of those choices have stayed suboptimal, and for a while it seemed as if there was a legitimate argument for Yoshi being a one-time fluke. After all, Yoshi's success lies in the precise use of his super armor to essentially parry opponents' moves. This is a game-warping playstyle, but it's also an insanely difficult one that requires an immense amount of character specialization. Most low tiers lack a unique mechanic of that caliber, and it seemed safe to assume that as a result, they simply don't have the same degree of hidden unlockable potential. But Melee eventually did find its next Yoshi, and that lack of depth might be what made Donkey Kong's sudden ascension all the more shocking. Donkey Kong doesn't have a particularly unique game plan or exceptionally difficult tech. His playstyle is fairly straightforward and pretty easy to replicate, at least in Melee terms where no character is truly easy. But within just a few years, Donkey Kong jumped from 16th straight past the line of viability, thanks in large part to the efforts of Junebug, whose consistently strong placements with Donkey Kong have become commonplace. Although his run to third at Supernova 2024 was anything but. This third place finish is the best Donkey Kong placement at a major ever, but Junebug isn't even the only Donkey Kong, being one of 3 to grace the most recent top 100. This rise past the line of viability is so sudden, so unexpected, and so significant that prominent Melee content creator Turned Down for Walt literally referred to him as a DLC character. And Moki, when creating the tier list we discussed earlier, shrugged his shoulders when he got to Donkey Kong and said, "He's still new." Over 2 decades after the game's initial release. Nobody's entirely sure where Donkey Kong's peak is, but in a way, such a comparatively simple character making such a big splash has opened up more questions than Yoshi ever did. And now that lightning has struck more than once, the loudest question might once again be, who's next? Answering that question might be the most difficult it's ever been. Every time the Melee tier list shifts, the number of unexplored low tiers shrinks, and the very exhaustible supply of characters with legitimate potential is already pretty short on candidates. Personally, my vote is for Mewtwo, but regardless of who makes the jump next, at this point it seems a little naive to think that Donkey Kong is going to shut the door behind him, just as it seems naive to think that the next tier list will be the first to represent a completely accurate view of the top tiers without character popularity or recency bias coloring people's perception of relative power. Even after 25 years of competition, Melee isn't even close to being solved, and tier lists are just a reflection of that uncertainty. Of course, pointing out an inaccuracy is much easier than presenting a more accurate list yourself, which is a task I'm nowhere near qualified for. But before I go, I would like to leave you with a tier list from None, who is perhaps the only top player to truly crack the code.